Hi everyone, my name is Eric McCabe, and this video is a very brief introduction to Trauma Center, Trauma Sensitive Yoga. So I'm going to share with you my screen. Right, there we go. So Trauma Center, Trauma Sensitive Yoga, TCTSY, was started in Brookline, Massachusetts, where the Trauma Center is. And it was developed by a Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, as well as a yoga teacher named David Emerson. TCTSY is grounded in three theories or three systems. The first is trauma theory, the second is attachment theory, and the third is neuroscience. So what I'm going to do right now is share with you what I mean by these three different theories. So the first is trauma theory. And so the question is, if we want to know what trauma-sensitive yoga is, we have to know what do we mean by trauma. So one way of talking about trauma is the diagnosis known as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And PTSD can be a host of things. It was originally associated with veterans coming back from, for example, the Vietnam War. And so it could be a single event that happened to a person that traumatized them, and all of a sudden they can't function the way that they are used to functioning in their everyday life. PTSD is symptom-oriented, so you might have some physical or mental symptoms like anxiety or depression, or pain in your back, or things like that. And if you have this PTSD diagnosis, then you can get funding for treatment. Another kind of trauma that is often kind of assumed or talked about, but not necessarily connected to funding, is trauma that occurs within the context of relationships and more than one time. And this is, a lot of work has been done on this by Dr. Judith Herman. So what is CPTSD, this complex trauma? Oftentimes complex trauma refers to, for example, a child who has grown up in a household that they've experienced neglect to some degree. Maybe their parents were not available for them, or maybe they witnessed violence in their neighborhood regularly. And that has it has left an imprint of trauma from their early childhood. And so this is also a kind of trauma that trauma-sensitive yoga is treating. This quote from Judith Herman, she writes, "No intervention that takes power away from the survivor can possibly foster her recovery, no matter how much it appears to be in her immediate best interest." So Dr. Judith Herman was talking especially about housewives that may have been trapped in an abusive relationship. That's also a kind of trauma. And her point here is that if we do interventions for people with trauma that takes power away from them, then it's not going to actually help to heal trauma. And so what that means for us in a trauma-sensitive yoga class is that I'm not here to tell you what to do or tell you what to, I'm not trying to teach you yoga as much as offer you an opportunity to explore your own physical body and to notice your body. And trauma-sensitive yoga is all 100% based in making choices, because when you choose to do something, it's empowering. It can empower you. So with trauma, choice has been taken away from a trauma survivor. The choice has been, that's what one definition of trauma is. It's being in a position of extreme lack of choice. Nobody chooses trauma, and yet that if we've had that choice robbed from us, then it makes it difficult to engage with choice on a regular basis, to make our own choices. A lot of trauma survivors have a very difficult time choosing how they want to live their lives and feeling a sense of agency over themselves, that they can have some bit of influence over their environment. So what we're doing with trauma-sensitive yoga is allowing a survivor to have opportunities to make choices in the context of a yoga class. So one way to think about trauma-sensitive yoga is that it gives you an opportunity to practice making choices. It's one thing to say, hey, you have choices and you can go make them. But in the trauma-sensitive yoga class, we actually give you an opportunity to practice making a choice. And if you want, check out some of the videos that I've created on YouTube, and you can see what I mean there by that. Okay, another way of talking about trauma is this DESNOS, disorders of extreme stress not otherwise specified. And this is also kind of relational trauma. By relational, I mean having to do with your significant relationships, mother to child, or mother or father to child, or spouses, or other relationships, maybe uncles and aunts, and etc. Self-harm is recognized as a common symptom. Other symptoms include sleeping disorders, eating disorders. ADHD is sometimes misdiagnosed as trauma, and all kinds of, any kind of perhaps self-destructive behavior. These all have complex trauma underneath them. And a lot of times, hurting oneself is a means to actually feel your own body. And so that's why we're using yoga as a means to kind of gently bring our attention back to our body and notice our body, feel it, see if we can get some kind of feeling in our body. Because if you're a trauma survivor, sometimes the last place you want to actually be is in your physical body. And so we're using yoga as an opportunity to kind of return to our physical body. The other underpinning of trauma-sensitive yoga is attachment theory. So what is attachment theory? This is from one of the founders of attachment theory, Mary Ainsworth. She says, an infant whose mother's responsiveness helps him to achieve his ends develops confidence in his own ability to control what happens to him. So in other words, if your mother or any significant caregiver was responsive to your needs, that affects your ability to live and function in our society, in our world. And so the relationships that you've had from early childhood affect how you are today. If you had a very loving parent watching over you, taking care of you, noticing when your needs weren't being met, and responding to them. So like, for example, a baby cries. Well, what does the mother do? Picks the child up, carries the baby, maybe rocks her a little bit, gives her milk, these kind of things. As the child gets older, becomes a toddler, different needs are needed, and the parent is right there responsive to those needs. That's maybe perhaps an ideal situation, but for trauma survivors, many times those needs didn't get met for a variety of reasons. And this is not to blame your parents for not doing their job or anything like that, but it's just trying to show the connection that the way that our relationships were in early childhood affect us all the way through adulthood into the end of our life. Relationships support the development of agency. So if we've had good attachment in an early childhood, that affects our ability to feel like we have a sense of control over our environment, that we have a sense of influence over others in our lives. The child who receives relatively consistent sensitive responses from caregivers develops a basic sense of safety in the world, an understanding of others as responsive and trustworthy, and an understanding of the self as worthy of care. So that's when attachment has gone really well for a child, then they have a sense of that the world is a safe place and that others are worthy of trust, right? So think about the opposite of that. If you haven't had a good attachment in your early childhood, what happens for the infant and young child exposed to chaos, violence, or neglect? Interpretation of sensory stimuli will become infused with danger. At this stage, given nonverbal processing, cues of potential danger will generalize and be solidified without language. What is this saying? This is basically saying that if you have not had that good attachment from a young age, then your interpretation of the world is that it is a dangerous place to be in. And your ability to trust other people, significant people in your life, may be severely compromised. You might have really difficult time trusting people, even that are very close to you. Okay, and the third and the last underpinning of trauma-sensitive yoga is neuroscience. Antonio Damasio, a neurologist, he writes, if there had been no body, there would be no brain. And so a lot of treatments for trauma circle around cognitive therapies. And these therapies are very beneficial, they're very important. However, if our brains were not seated in an entire body, then there would be no brain to speak of. You know, this is coming from an evolutionary perspective, what we call the bottom-up perspective. And so yoga gives us that ground-up perspective. We start with, rather than focusing on thoughts and what's going on in the brain, or even feelings that are happening to us, we start out with our physical body. Now, trauma-sensitive yoga has effects on one's brain. So there's that body-mind connection. When you use your body in certain ways and you draw your attention to your physical body, the sensations in your body, that's going to actually have an effect on your brain. So here's an image of the brain. One of the regions of the brain, Broca's area, this has to do with one's language skills, and it has to do with the ability to actually speak well about trauma. And this area is affected for many survivors. Another important region of the brain is called the insular cortex, and you can see it here in kind of the light purple. And this insular region is what gets stimulated with trauma-sensitive yoga. What we're doing when we draw our attention, our awareness to the physical sensations in our body, then we're stimulating that region in the brain. And for survivors, that's huge, because this area for people without trauma is well stimulated, meaning people have many people have a strong sense that they are in their bodies. But for trauma survivors, that sense might not be there. And for many survivors, the insular cortex is understimulated. But what we found with doing yoga for trauma is that the insular cortex gets stimulated. And there's actually been a study that shows this, that you can see here on the left-hand side, this yellow region being well stimulated after a yoga class. So this is just a little taste of kind of the theory underlying trauma-sensitive yoga. If you're interested in learning more, check out some of the videos that I've created for you on YouTube, and feel free to reach out to me with any questions that you have, or if you'd like to try some trauma-sensitive yoga. All right, thank you.